Hello, I will be reading Dark Age America Involuntary Simplicity by John Michael Greer, Part 2. That's not to say that this unraveling will be a simple process. All those millions of people whose jobs depend on intermediation, and thus on the maintenance of current levels of economic complexity, have an understandable interest in staying employed. That interest in practice works out to an increasingly frantic quest to keep people from sidestepping the baroque corporate and bureaucratic economic machine and getting goods and services directly from producers. That's a great deal of what drives the ongoing crusade against alternative healthcare. Every dollar spent on herbs from a medical herbalist or treatments from an acupuncturist is a dollar that doesn't go into feeding the gargantuan corporations and bureaucracies that are supposed to provide healthcare for Americans and sometimes even do so. The same thing is driving corporate and government attacks on local food production, since every dollar a customer spends buying zucchini from a backyard farmer doesn't prop up the equally huge and tottering mass of institutions that attempt to control the production and sale of food in America. It's not uncommon for those who object to these maneuvers to portray them as acts of a triumphant corporate despotism on the brink of seizing total power over the planet. I'd like to suggest there's something quite different. While the American and global economies are both still growing in a notional sense, the measures of growth that yield that result factor in such things as the manufacture of derivatives and a great many other forms of fictive wealth. Subtract those from the national and global balance sheet, and the result is an economy in contraction. The ongoing rise in the permanently jobless, the epidemic of malign neglect, affecting even the most crucial elements of America's infrastructure, and the ongoing decline in income and living standards among all of those classes that lack access to fictive wealth, among many other things, all tell the same story. Thus, it's far from surprising that all the people whose jobs are dependent on intermediation, all the way up the corporate food chain to the corner offices, are increasingly worried about the number of people who are trying to engage in disintermediation, to buy food, health care, and other goods and services directly from the producers. Their worries are entirely rational. One of the results of the contraction of the real economy is that the costs of intermediation, financial and otherwise, have not merely gone through the roof but zoomed off into the stratosphere, with low Earth orbit the next logical step. Healthcare, again, is among the most obvious examples. In most parts of the United States, for instance, a visit to the acupuncturist for some ordinary health condition will typically set you back under $100. While if you go to an MD for the same thing, you'll be lucky to get away for under $1,000, counting lab work and other costs. And you could typically count on 30 or 40 minutes of personal attention from the acupuncturist as compared to 5 or 10 minutes with a harried and distracted MD. It's therefore no surprise that more and more Americans are turning their backs on the officially sanctioned healthcare industry and seeking out alternative healthcare instead. They'll probably be just as happy to go to an ordinary MD who offered medical care on the same terms as the acupuncturist, which happened to be the same terms that were standard a century ago for every kind of healthcare. As matters stand, though, physicians are dependent on the system as it presently exists. Their standing with their peers and even their legal right to practice medicine depends on their willingness to play by the rules of intermediation. And of course, it's also true that acupuncturists don't generally make the six-figure salaries that so many physicians do in America. 100 years ago, the average American doctor didn't make that much more than the average American plumber. Many of the changes in the U.S. healthcare system since that time were quite openly intended to change that fact. 100 years ago, as the United States moved through the early stages of its age of imperial excess, that was something the nation could afford. Equally, all the other modes of profiteering, intermediation, and other maneuvers aimed at maximizing the take of assorted economic sectors were viable then, since a growing economy provides plenty of slack for such projects. As the economics of growth gave way to the economics of stagnation in the last quarter of the 20th century, such things became considerably more burdensome. As stagnation gives way to contraction and the negative returns on excess complexity combine with the impact of depleting non-renewable resources, the burden is rapidly becoming more that the U.S. economy or the wider society can bear. The result, in one way or another, will be disintermediation, the dissolution of the complex relations and institutions that currently come between the producer and the consumer of goods and services, and the replacement by something much less costly to maintain. In one way or another, though, covers a great deal of ground, and it's far from easy to predict exactly how the current system will come unglued if the United States, or for that matter, anywhere else. This intermediation might happen quickly if a major crisis shatters some central element of the U.S. economic system. For example, the financial sector and forces the entire economy to regroup around less abstract and more local systems of exchange. It might happen slowly as more and more of the population can no longer afford to participate in the intermediated economy at all, and have to craft their own localized economies from the bottom up, while the narrowing circle of the well-to-do continue to make use of some equivalent of the current system for a long time to come. It might happen at different rates in different geographical areas. For example, cities and their suburbs might keep the intermediated economy going long after rural areas have abandoned it, or what have you. Plenty of people these days like to look forward to some such transformation, and not without reason. Complexity has long since passed the point of negative returns in the U.S. economy, as in most other aspects of American society, and the coming of disintermediation across a wide range of economic activities will arguably lead to significant improvements in many aspects of our collective life. That said, it's not all roses and affordable health care. The extravagant rates of energy per capita that made today's absurdly complex economy possible also made it possible for millions of Americans to make their living working in offices and other relatively comfortable settings, rather than standing hip deep in hog manure with a shovel in their hands. And it also allowed them to earn what currently passes for a normal income, rather than the bare subsistence that's actually normal in societies that have had their economies inflated to the bursting point by a temporary glut of cheap energy. It was popular a number of years back for the urban and suburban middle classes, most of them work in jobs that only exist due to intermediation, to go in for voluntary simplicity. At best, a pallid half equivalent of Thoreau's far more challenging concept of voluntary poverty. At worst, a marketing gimmick for the consumption of round after round of overpriced simple products. For all of its more embarrassing features, the voluntary simplicity movement was at least occasionally motivated by an honest recognition of the immediate personal implications of Tainer's fundamental point, that complexity taken past the point of diminishing returns becomes a burden rather than a benefit. In the years ahead of us, a great many of these same people are going to experience what I suppose might be called involuntary simplicity, the disintermediation of most aspects of economic life, the departure of lifestyles that can only be supported by the cheap, abundant energy of the recent past, and a transition to the much less complex and often much less comfortable lifestyles that are all that's possible in a deindustrial world. There might be a certain entertainment value in watching what those who praised voluntary simplicity to the skies think of simple living when it's no longer voluntary, and there's no way back to the comforts of a bygone era. That said, the impact of involuntary simplicity on the economic sphere won't be limited to the lifestyles of the formerly privileged. It promises to bring to an end to certain features of economic life that contemporary thought assumes are fixed in place forever. Among them, the market economy itself. We'll talk about that next week.